The moment Greg's words left his mouth, the tension in the room thickened. "We're all leaving if you're CEO. This business is done." His voice carried the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. I barely glanced up from the stack of letters on my desk as Fu, my assistant, leaned in and murmured, "He snuck in without anyone noticing." Of course he did. Greg had always been the type to play office politics behind closed doors, thinking he was the smartest person in the room. So this was what it was about. The veiled threats, the passive-aggressive remarks, the smug way he used to leave my office whenever I refused to cave to his constant demands for a raise. "You'll regret this," he would mutter, as if he were orchestrating some grand scheme. And now here he was, believing he had the upper hand. I set the letters down deliberately, meeting his gaze. "Greg, just so we're clear, you're saying you intend to resign?" He laughed, a deep, self-assured sound as he clutched his stomach. "Not just me. If you won't raise my salary, I have no choice but to walk. Talented people leave uninspired companies, you know." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him shift uncomfortably. Then, with a measured tone, I said, "Understood. I'll have the paperwork ready for you by the end of the day." The smirk vanished from Greg's face in an instant. "What?" he spluttered, caught completely off guard. He had expected me to grovel, to negotiate, to beg him to stay. What he hadn't expected was for me to call his bluff. I leaned back in my chair, watching the realization dawn on him. He wasn't indispensable. If anything, his departure would be a relief. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Adrian, and I'm the CEO of a mid-sized tech startup." Might sound impressive, but the truth is, stepping into this role was never part of my plan. I didn't build this company. My father did. He had spent years, maybe even decades, pouring his soul into this business, working tirelessly to make it something meaningful. I had always admired his ambition from a distance, but I had my own path to follow. While he built his company, I built my career, working for a major international corporation overseas, climbing the ranks, tackling projects that excited me. He had asked me once to consider joining him. I told him I would, after I finished the project I was working on. By the time I was ready, it was too late. My father collapsed unexpectedly, and just like that, the company he had spent his life creating was left in limbo. I walked away from my career, packed up my life, and returned home to take over. It wasn't a grand, noble gesture. It was an obligation, a weight I hadn't been prepared for. But as the months passed, my perspective shifted. I began to see what my father had built, not just a business, but a vision. He had always believed in the power of innovation, in the potential of those who dared to think differently. He had believed in me, even when I hadn't believed in myself. Pursue your passions. Compete in your areas of strength. One day, you'll realize your true potential. His words echoed in my mind as I stood at the helm of his company, determined to take it further than even he had dreamed. But dreams and reality don't always align. A year into my tenure as CEO, I realized the company's biggest problem wasn't a lack of funding or innovation. It was the people within it. Office politics, complacency, entitlement, and at the center of it all was Greg, a department head who treated his position as a personal playground rather than a responsibility. He spent more time on side projects than actual work, dismissed deadlines as mere suggestions, and spoke to me as if I were a naive child playing dress-up as CEO. "Chris, I'm heading to the post office for a bit." Greg, who was in his 40s, older than me, but certainly not wiser, had said it with the casual arrogance of someone who believed rules didn't apply to him. Except they did. And now, as he stood before me, realizing that his carefully crafted rebellion was crumbling before it had even begun, I saw the truth settle in his eyes. I hadn't failed, but Greg had. The moment I questioned Greg, his expression twisted into an irritated grimace. Going to the post office during work hours isn't unusual, he shot back, already shifting the heavy bundle in his arms. I need to make a payment, and it's due today. He moved toward the exit, his body language radiating impatience. But something about his reasoning didn't sit right with me. Greg, we handle all payments through online banking. There's no reason to use a physical counter, and that's normally a job for accounting or sales, not you. Greg's grip on the package tightened. Well, this particular vendor doesn't use online payments, he said hastily. Some people still prefer the old-fashioned way. Besides, stepping out of the office now and then is a good way to recharge. Helps productivity, you know. I folded my arms. And that package? Delivering something for a client? His reaction was instant. Too fast. Too defensive. It's personal. Just dropping it off at my car. Honestly, Chris, you're way too uptight. You monitor your staff like a prison warden. It's uncomfortable. Before I could respond, he kicked the office door open and marched out. I exhaled slowly, watching him leave. According to whispers among the staff, Greg's main side hustle involved reselling products, something that wasn't against company policy, provided it didn't interfere with work or risk confidential information. But lately, too many red flags were stacking up. If he was running personal errands on company time, it was more than just a bad habit. It was a blatant abuse of his position. I wanted to believe I was overthinking things, that he wasn't actually using work hours to handle his side business. But the reports kept coming. One issue alone wouldn't have been alarming, but the troubling patterns were impossible to ignore. Employees had started complaining that snacks and coffee, purchased with employee dues, were vanishing at an alarming rate. The ground coffee beans, carefully rationed for the team, were disappearing twice as fast. Entire boxes of snacks, including some I had personally bought, were gone within a day. I had put up a notice to curb the issue, but the problem persisted. And then Vanessa, from accounting, approached me. "Chris, I need your help. It's Greg." Her voice was calm, but the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. His expense reports don't add up. He's filing claims for what clearly look like private drinking parties and family meals. That alone was bad enough, but Vanessa wasn't finished. Actually, she hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. I also saw him taking office supplies. He didn't even try to hide it. That made me pause. Vanessa wasn't the type to make careless accusations. She was sharp, one of the best in her field, with both a law degree and a CPA certification. I had always admired her resilience. Like me, she hadn't fit into the traditional mold in high school. She had spent years proving herself, determined to rise above those who had once dismissed her. But Greg? He had never respected her. He saw only the surface, making condescending remarks about her past truancy, disregarding her talent. Whenever I called him out, he would chuckle and say something patronizing like, "You're right, I'll go easy on her. She's a little emotionally fragile after all." It was insulting, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Vanessa, usually composed, looked genuinely frustrated. "This has been going on for a while, Chris." I didn't know if it was worth bringing up, but with everything else happening, I had to say something. I let out a slow breath, my mind racing. Greg had crossed too many lines. His questionable expense reports, his misuse of company time, his blatant disrespect for his colleagues. This wasn't just an issue of poor management anymore. It was a full-scale problem, and I was done looking the other way. The subtle warnings hadn't worked. Greg's behavior continued unchecked, and I could see the strain it was placing on Vanessa. Given his seniority and domineering attitude, it was no surprise that she found it difficult to stand up to him. As we spoke in the break room, Scott entered, heading toward the coffee machine. Around my age, Scott had previously run his own business before joining us. While his past venture hadn't succeeded, his insight into marketing and sales had been invaluable. More importantly, Scott had been with the company since my father founded it, making him one of the most experienced people on the team. In many ways, he was the backbone of the operation, ensuring things ran smoothly, even as I took on the role of CEO. Scott overheard part of our conversation and without hesitation interjected. "Vanessa, you need to tell Chris everything. You shouldn't be dealing with this alone. This isn't just your problem, it's a company problem." That small push seemed to be what Vanessa needed. Her usual composure wavered, and tears welled in her eyes as she finally opened up. She confessed that Greg had been repeatedly asking her to dinner. At first, she accepted, thinking it was a casual, professional meal. But it quickly became clear he had ulterior motives. Greg had a family, and his persistence made her deeply uncomfortable. Despite her knowledge of legal policies and workplace conduct, she struggled to take decisive action. She liked working here and didn't want to feel forced out. Her words only strengthened my resolve. Vanessa was a crucial part of our team, and she deserved to feel safe at work. Scott seemed to share my thoughts, his usual relaxed demeanor hardening. "This is serious, Chris. If this is true, Vanessa shouldn't have to put up with it. There needs to be disciplinary action." I nodded. "I completely agree. We'll set up an investigative committee and handle this properly. If anything else happens, let me know immediately." Just as we were discussing the next steps, Greg sauntered into the break room, his usual air of entitlement surrounding him. "How can you stand around talking in such a cramped space? Move aside. I need my coffee." He waved a dismissive hand in my direction, his words grating on my nerves. Reluctantly, I stepped aside, biting back the urge to call him out right then and there. Greg poured his coffee, then casually grabbed a handful of snacks from the communal table, stuffing them into his pockets without a second thought. Scott, ever the strategist, spoke up in a light-hearted tone. "Greg, if you take that many, no one else will get any. Those are my favorites, you know." Greg actually grinned. "Oh, you like these? I'll bring some for you next time then. Look forward to it." He chuckled as he walked out, his pockets still full of food. Vanessa sighed the moment he was gone. "He's never bringing anything back. He just takes." Her frustration mirrored my own. This wasn't just about a few missing snacks. It was about the culture of entitlement Greg had fostered within himself. As a leader, it was my responsibility to ensure a workplace where people felt valued and respected. And it was clear that Greg had no intention of changing unless he was forced to. I left the break room knowing exactly what needed to be done. The next morning, before I could even begin addressing Greg's misconduct, he stormed into my office unannounced. His expression was tight with indignation. "Ever since you took over as CEO, my salary hasn't increased. Care to explain why?" I'd spent the past year gaining a deeper understanding of the company's operations, and if Greg had put in even half the effort I had, I might have considered his request. But instead, he had spent his time misusing company resources, skimming off supplies, and forcing other employees to approach me with complaints on his behalf. And yet somehow, he still believed he was owed more. I kept my tone even. Growing this business means investing in our employees, attracting top talent, and ensuring long-term stability. I'm fully committed to rewarding hard work and dedication. I met his gaze. You'll see those investments in due time. I trust you'll continue putting in your best effort. Greg's face darkened, clearly unsatisfied. If you really valued talent, you'd raise my salary now. Otherwise, people like me will walk. Finding another job is easier than ever. His words were meant to be a threat, but all I felt was irritation. I forced a smile. I hear you, Greg, but sustainability is key. Increasing labor costs without justifying them through performance or revenue growth isn't a smart business move. His expression flickered. Whether it was frustration or the first hint of realization, I couldn't tell. But one thing was clear. Greg had underestimated me, and I was done letting him think otherwise. Greg's palm slammed against the desk, the sound echoing through the office. He twisted his lips into a smug grin, eyes glinting with misplaced confidence. I get it. That's your final answer, huh? No more groveling from me. With that, he spun on his heel and stormed out, making sure to slam the door hard enough to rattle the frames on the walls. Later that evening, after returning from a business meeting, I found a thick stack of envelopes piled neatly on my desk. My brow furrowed as I picked one up, flipping it over. Resignation letter. I quickly rifled through the rest, dozens of them, each signed and dated. A coordinated mass resignation? That was unheard of. Before I could process it, I sensed movement. I looked up to see Greg standing smugly in the doorway, arms crossed, reveling in his theatrics. If you're staying on as CEO, we're all leaving. This company is finished. So that was his grand play. I exhaled slowly, setting the envelopes down. It wasn't the first time Greg had thrown a tantrum when denied a raise, but this was his boldest stunt yet. Every time I turned him down, he'd leave with a not-so-subtle warning. You'll regret this. I had expected retaliation, but not something so reckless. Still, I needed clarity. So, to be clear, Greg, you're officially resigning. His laughter boomed through the office as he clutched his stomach like I had just told the world's funniest joke. That's right. You won't raise my salary, so I have no choice. We're in an era where talented people leave uninspiring companies. You should have seen this coming. I met his gaze, calm and unwavering. Understood. Thank you for your service. I'll begin processing your exit paperwork. Greg's grin faltered. What? His voice lost its bravado, morphing into confusion. What do you mean, my exit? You're bluffing. He expected panic. He expected me to beg him to stay. But what he didn't expect was the trap he had set for himself. You seem to believe you're taking key staff with you, I said, watching his expression closely. But you might want to confirm that before making assumptions. Greg scoffed, leaning forward. Scott and Vanessa are coming with me. You're about to lose your most valuable employees. Right on cue, the office door swung open. Scott and Vanessa stepped inside, their faces unreadable. Vanessa was the first to speak, her voice cool but firm. That would only be true if you worked as hard as the rest of us, Greg. But we've gathered more than enough evidence of your misconduct. You'll have to face the consequences. Greg's smugness shattered. He darted his gaze between them, his voice turning unsteady. What's going on? You two said you were leaving with me. We had a deal. Scott sighed, arms crossed as he leaned against the desk. Yeah, we said it sounded interesting. But starting a company isn't just about walking out and expecting success. Someone who can't even manage his own responsibilities has no business leading a team. Why would we follow you when we already know your ship is sinking? Greg's face turned red, his confidence unraveling. You're making a mistake. Scott ignored him, shaking his head. By the way, this company you're planning to start, are you going to let employees run side gigs on company time? Because if so, maybe I'll work for you and keep my job here. Greg stiffened. What the hell are you talking about? Scott's smirk deepened. Oh, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I already told Chris about how you've been using office hours for your reselling business. Greg went pale. That's ridiculous. I don't... Then why do you keep sneaking off to the post office? Scott pressed. You claim you're making payments, but there's no record of transactions. And here's the fun part. I actually went with you once just to see for myself. Greg's whole body tensed. You followed me? His voice was laced with both outrage and fear. Scott tilted his head, feigning innocence. Followed? Number just observed. But if you're so defensive, maybe there's something worth hiding. Greg's mask finally cracked, his bravado drained away, replaced by a look of pure panic. And just like that, his carefully planned coup collapsed before his eyes. Greg's face twisted with desperation, his bravado slipping as he tried to shift the blame. This is cowardly. Besides, it's management's fault I'm underpaid. I have a family to support. I had no choice. His voice wavered, grasping for sympathy. The excuse was flimsy at best. Greg was earning well above industry standards. If he was struggling financially, it was either sheer mismanagement or an outright lie. His attempts at justification only made the silence in the room heavier. Vanessa, standing her ground, folded her arms and coolly met his gaze. So, is that why you filed fake expense reports? Her tone was sharp, cutting through his facade. Claiming family dinners as business meetings, submitting receipts for personal purchases, because we've verified everything. Greg paled instantly, beads of sweat forming at his temples. His hands clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. His reaction was all the confirmation we needed. Vanessa took a slow step forward. You recognize that old printer in the CEO's office? She pointed toward it. I bought it, off a marketplace app. Greg's breath hitched. His eyes darted between the printer and Vanessa as realization dawned. No way. His voice cracked, his palm covering his mouth. Yes, Vanessa continued, her voice like ice. You've been stealing company equipment and reselling it. The model numbers match, Greg, and some still had the company's property tags on them. She gave him a mockingly thoughtful look. Your reselling business must have been booming. Too bad I was your biggest buyer. Greg staggered back, his face drained of color. You know, Vanessa continued, embezzlement like this, it carries a prison sentence of up to 10 years. And let's not forget all those times you mocked me for dropping out of school. That's slander, punishable by fines or even jail time. She tilted her head. Care to guess the maximum sentence? Greg finally broke. Please, he stammered. Please, Vanessa, But she wasn't done. And, she added, her voice turning razor sharp, you remember the time you tried to coerce me into going to a bar with you, even after I refused? Because I do. That's classified as non-consensual misconduct. You're looking at another 6 months to 10 years behind bars for that. Greg collapsed onto his knees, his breath ragged, eyes unfocused. His lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, he turned to me, his voice hoarse. So, you knew? That they weren't actually going to quit? His shoulders sagged. At this rate, no one's coming with me. No one's following me. I sighed, folding my hands on my desk. Greg, I don't think I'm some perfect leader. When I first saw that stack of resignation letters, I almost believed it, almost blamed myself for failing my employees. I leaned back, but then I noticed something strange. All the handwriting was the same. It was a desperate attempt at manipulation. And when you claimed that others were leaving with you, that only confirmed my suspicions. I exhaled and straightened. Either way, you can't stay here. Pack up your things. You'll be contacted about what comes next. Thank you for your time. Greg didn't argue. He just stood up, shoulders hunched, and walked out of my office in silence. As the investigation progressed, the depths of his misconduct became even more disturbing. We uncovered his worst offense. He had been selling client data to third-party vendors for profit. The sheer breach of trust and security was staggering. Legal action would take time, but the case against him was ironclad. Meanwhile, his side business, hustle reselling items, completely crumbled. Vanessa, his primary buyer, had only ever purchased from him to build a case. With her out of the picture, Greg was left with excess inventory and nowhere to turn. Word spread fast. Within months, Greg had sold his newly built home, forced to downsize to a small apartment. His family, once his greatest excuse, had abandoned him. As for me, I refocused my energy on growing the company with the team that truly mattered. I had made mistakes along the way, but one thing was clear. I wouldn't let a parasite like Greg drag us down ever again.